1925. An official United States Army War College document, written by military officers, reviewed by military leadership, filed in official government archives, contained the following assessment of Black American men. The Negro does not perform his share of civil duties in time of peace in proportion to his population. He has no leaders in industrial or commercial life. He takes no part in government compared to the white man. He is admittedly of inferior mentality. He is inherently weak in character. This was not a fringe opinion expressed by a disgruntled soldier. This was official United States military doctrine, written down, filed, used to shape policy. And 16 years later, more than 1.2 million Black Americans would be asked to risk their lives for the country that had filed that document. They said yes. And then they spent the next 4 years proving every word of it devastatingly, permanently, undeniably wrong. This is their story, not the sanitized version, not the footnote, the full account of what they were asked to do, what they were denied while doing it, what they achieved despite everything working against them, and why the truth of their service was buried for decades after the war ended. Before we go any further, I need to take a moment and tell you why this story is on Hidden Black Files. Because the story of Black Americans in World War II is one of the most powerful, most documented, and most consistently undertaught chapters in American history. Not because the information doesn't exist. It exists. It's in archives. It's in congressional records. It's in the testimony of the men and women who lived it. But there is a version of World War II history that gets taught in American schools. The Greatest Generation, the liberation of Europe, the defeat of fascism, and the 1.2 million Black Americans who served in that war are, at best, a paragraph in that version. I built Hidden Black Files because I grew up learning that paragraph. And then I started researching, and I found the full story. And the gap between what I had been given and what actually happened was so large that it changed how I understood everything. Not just military history, but the entire arc of Black American life in the 20th century. The men and women you're about to hear about fought 2 wars simultaneously. One against fascism on battlefields in Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa. One against racism inside the military that sent them there, in the communities that surrounded their training bases, and in the country they had sworn to defend. They won both, and most people have never been properly told. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files right now. Hit the bell. What you're about to hear is the history that the Greatest Generation narrative was built to obscure. September 1940. War is consuming Europe. Nazi Germany has already swept through Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. Britain is under aerial bombardment. The United States has not yet entered the conflict officially, but everyone can see which direction history is moving. Civil rights leaders saw an opportunity in this moment, not callously, but strategically. They understood something that the Roosevelt administration was trying not to admit. America could not fight a war against fascist racial ideology while maintaining its own system of racial hierarchy, without a contradiction that would eventually become impossible to ignore. They pressured President Roosevelt to act. The result was the Selective Service and Training Act of 1940, which on paper explicitly outlawed racial discrimination in the military draft process. On paper, Roosevelt's Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, had no interest in genuine integration. What the act produced in practice was segregation with updated language. Black men could be accepted, but only into units and training facilities specifically designated for their race. The paperwork changed. The system didn't, and so over 1.2 million Black Americans would enter a military that had already decided, in official doctrine, what they were capable of. They were about to spend 4 years correcting that assessment. To understand what Black soldiers were walking into when they enlisted, you need to understand the world they were leaving. For centuries, Black Americans had given everything to a country that returned almost nothing, enslaved and forced to build the foundations of American wealth. Freed and then systematically re-enslaved, through convict leasing and debt peonage, subject to Jim Crow laws that regulated every aspect of daily life, targets of lynch mobs that operated with near-total impunity, excluded from the economic opportunities and social institutions that were supposed to be available to all Americans. And yet, when the call came, they answered. Over 1.2 million black men and women volunteered or were drafted for World War II service. More than 1 million people, stepping forward to serve a country that had, within living memory of many of them, been running an official slavery operation and using the legal system as a tool of racial terror. Why? The answers are complicated and individual and worth sitting with. Some believed in America's stated ideals, even when the practice fell catastrophically short of them. Some saw military service as a path to citizenship recognition that civilian life denied them. Some were drafted and went because they had no choice. Some went specifically because they intended to prove something, to force the country to confront the contradiction between what it claimed to be and what it actually was. All of them, whatever their reasons, walked into a military that had been deliberately designed to keep them in their place. The military system of segregation was not a casual arrangement or an oversight. It was an architecture, deliberate, comprehensive, and enforced at every level. Separate barracks, separate mess halls, separate hospitals, separate blood banks, because the military had decided, against all scientific evidence, that black blood was not suitable for transfusion into white soldiers. Read that again. Separate blood banks. In a war where blood transfusions were saving lives on the battlefield every day, the United States military maintained segregated blood supplies based on a racial belief that had no biological foundation whatsoever. The majority of segregated training facilities were placed in the South, where Jim Crow laws could reinforce military segregation policies, where the surrounding civilian community could be counted on to remind black soldiers, in case the military's own message wasn't clear enough, of their place in the American social order. The largest installation for black soldiers, Fort Huachuca, was placed in the Arizona desert, deliberately isolated from white population centers. At these bases, black soldiers faced harassment from white officers who were frequently chosen specifically from southern states, men who had grown up inside the Jim Crow system and could be counted on to maintain what the military called proper racial relations. And then there was the insult that no amount of diplomatic language can adequately describe. German prisoners of war, men captured while fighting for Adolf Hitler's regime, men who had been actively trying to kill American soldiers, were treated with more respect on American soil than the black Americans in U.S. uniform serving at the same bases. German POWs ate in restaurants that refused to serve black soldiers. German POWs received courtesies and dignities that black soldiers were explicitly denied. Professor Matthew Dalmont of Dartmouth College described the conditions with a precision that cuts through any remaining euphemism. They were often held in slavish conditions and were treated like animals. They were called racial epithets quite regularly and just not afforded respect, either as soldiers or as human beings. This was the America of 1940, calling on black citizens to fight fascism abroad while practicing its own version of it at home. Before we go into the stories of the individual men who refused to let this system define them, we want to ask you a question. And we genuinely want your answer in the comments, because this is one of the most important questions this history raises. Black Americans volunteered in massive numbers to fight for a country that maintained segregated blood banks, treated German POWs better than black soldiers, and had official military doctrine declaring black men inherently weak in character. What does that level of commitment, in the face of that level of betrayal, tell you about black Americans' relationship to the idea of America? Leave your answer below. We read every comment on this channel. This one matters. The military's refusal to deploy black soldiers in combat roles was not simply about prejudice, though it was certainly rooted in prejudice. It was about something the military leadership found even more threatening than racial prejudice could fully explain: power. A black man with a weapon and military training was not just a soldier. He was a refutation. He was living proof that the ideology justifying everything that had been done to black Americans, the claim that black people were inherently inferior, inherently suited to serve rather than lead, inherently incapable of the agency and courage that combat required, was a lie. Author Christopher Paul Moore identified this precisely. Black Americans carrying weapons, either as infantry, tank corps, or as pilots, was simply an unthinkable notion. Because to arm black men, to train them as equals on the battlefield, would shatter the lie that had been upheld for generations, that black people were meant to serve, not to lead, that they were meant to obey, not to conquer. So black soldiers were assigned to service units, cooking meals, fixing vehicles, moving supplies, building infrastructure, the essential, unglamorous, backbreaking labor that kept the military functioning, work that was entirely necessary, but was assigned to black soldiers, not because they were the only ones capable of it, but because it kept them away from weapons, away from command, away from any situation that might require the military to acknowledge what they were actually capable of. But the military could not entirely control what happened under fire. And under fire, several men made the system's ideology impossible to maintain. Edward A. Carter, born in 1916, the son of a missionary father who had worked in India and China. By the time World War II began, Carter had already spent years fighting. He had volunteered to fight fascism in the Spanish Civil War, while most of the world's governments were still deciding whether to notice. He spoke 4 languages: Hindi, Chinese, German, and English. He had combat experience, real combat experience against real fascists in real terrain. The kind of experience that military commanders built training programs trying to replicate. The United States Army's assessment of what to do with this experienced, multilingual, combat-tested soldier: make him a cook. Edward Carter, a man who had literally already fought fascism before most of his fellow soldiers had heard the word, spent the early part of World War II in a kitchen because the Army could not reconcile his reality with its ideology. When the Army finally ran desperately short of soldiers and began allowing black men into combat roles, Carter stepped forward without hesitation. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of individual combat courage documented in the entire war. During an engagement near Speyer, Germany, Carter's unit came under heavy fire. Carter volunteered to lead a 3-man patrol to investigate enemy positions. His 2 companions were wounded almost immediately. Carter continued alone. He was hit by enemy fire. He kept moving. He was hit again. He kept moving. When a group of 8 German soldiers attempted to capture him, he killed 6 of them and captured the other 2, using them as human shields as he made his way back to American lines, where he provided intelligence that saved lives. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. What he deserved was the Medal of Honor. He received it posthumously in 1997, 34 years after his death. The Army that had made this combat veteran a cook because of his race finally gave him its highest honor 3 decades after he could no longer receive it. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Dory Miller was 22 years old, serving aboard the USS West Virginia. His assignment: ship's cook and laundry attendant. The Navy had decided, as formal policy, that black sailors should not handle weapons. They were not trained on weapons. They were not assigned to weapon positions. Then Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor. What happened in the next hour is one of the most remarkable accounts of individual action in American military history. Miller ran through chaos and fire to reach his wounded captain, dragged him to a position of relative safety, and then, seeing an unmanned .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun with enemy aircraft still attacking, sat down behind it. He had never been trained on this weapon. The Navy's policy had made certain of that. For 15 minutes, Doris Miller fired that gun at attacking Japanese aircraft. When asked afterward how he managed to operate a weapon he had never been trained on, Miller's answer was characteristically understated. "It wasn't hard. I just pulled the trigger and she worked fine. I had watched the others with these guns." He had watched. He had learned. He had filed the knowledge away in case it was ever needed. In case the Navy's policy ever became irrelevant in the face of something larger. On December 7, 1941, it became irrelevant. Miller was awarded the Navy Cross, the first Black American to receive that decoration. He was killed in action 2 years later when the USS Liscum Bay was torpedoed in the Pacific. The Navy that had decided black sailors shouldn't handle weapons buried him without the Medal of Honor he had earned. Vernon Baker, Italy. April 1945. Baker's platoon was advancing toward a German-held position near Viareggio when they ran into one of the Wehrmacht's most formidable defensive systems. Fortified machine gun nests, observation posts, and prepared fighting positions designed to stop exactly the kind of advance Baker had been ordered to conduct. What Baker did over the next 2 days defies easy summary. He personally destroyed multiple German machine gun positions, killed 3 enemy soldiers at one position, took out 2 more at an observation post, led assaults on 2 additional machine gun nests. When his fellow soldiers were wounded, he deliberately drew enemy fire onto himself, making himself the target so his men could move to safety. The next night, he volunteered to lead a battalion through minefields in the dark. Baker received the Distinguished Service Cross in 1945. He waited 52 years for the Medal of Honor. In 1997, President Clinton held a ceremony for 7 black soldiers whose heroism in World War II had been recognized with Distinguished Service Crosses, rather than the Medals of Honor. The Army's own review concluded they had earned. The review found a consistent pattern. Black soldiers performing actions identical or superior to those recognized with the Medal of Honor in white soldiers had been systematically awarded lesser recognition. Vernon Baker was the only one of the 7 still alive to receive his Medal of Honor in person. He was 77 years old. We want to pause here and ask you something directly, and we want you to answer in the comments. Edward Carter was made a cook despite prior combat experience. Dory Miller operated a weapon he'd never been trained on because the Navy refused to train him. Vernon Baker waited 52 years for the recognition his own Army's review said he deserved. What does the pattern across all 3 of these stories tell you about how institutional racism works? Not as individual prejudice, but as a system. Drop your answer below. These 3 men were extraordinary, but they were not exceptions to the black military experience in World War II. They were examples of what the military was systematically trying to prevent from becoming visible. And nowhere was that more true than in the sky. In 1939, as war was spreading through Europe, the U.S. government created the Civilian Pilot Training Program, a federally funded initiative that, for the first time, allowed black Americans to train on combat aircraft. Civil rights organizations immediately recognized the opening and pushed hard. Their pressure produced something that surprised almost everyone who opposed it. In January 1941, Secretary of War Henry Stimson approved the formation of an all-black 99th Fighter Squadron. Training would be conducted at Tuskegee, Alabama, at the institute once led by Booker T. Washington. The approval came with a near-universal expectation of failure. Military leadership believed, and said openly, that black pilots simply could not handle the cognitive and physical demands of aerial combat. The 1925 Army War College documents assessment of black inferiority had shaped a generation of military thinking. The Tuskegee experiment, as many in the military saw it, would simply provide scientific confirmation of what they already believed. They were preparing to be proven right. Instead, they were proven wrong in the most public and irrefutable way possible. Between 1943 and 1945, the pilots who became known as the Tuskegee Airmen flew more than 15,000 combat sorties. Let that number sit for a moment. 15,000 individual combat missions over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world. They destroyed 112 enemy aircraft. They damaged or destroyed hundreds of ground targets. They completed some of the longest bomber escort missions of the entire European theater, and they achieved one of the lowest loss records of any escort fighter group in the Allied air forces. Not one of the lowest among black units, one of the lowest among all Allied fighter escort groups. Allied bomber crews began specifically requesting the Tuskegee Airmen for escort protection. Not because of politics, not because of policy, because when the Tuskegee Airmen were your escort, you came home. On March 24, 1945, the 332nd Fighter Group flew the longest bomber escort mission of the war, all the way to Berlin, deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. During that single mission, they destroyed 3 German jet fighters and damaged 5 more. The military that had assembled to watch them fail had instead watched them become some of the finest combat aviators in the world. The 99th Squadron earned 2 Presidential Unit citations. The Tuskegee Airmen earned more than 150 Distinguished Flying Crosses. And they did all of it while returning to segregated bases, sleeping in segregated barracks, being refused service at facilities that served German prisoners of war. While the Tuskegee Airmen were proving the military's doctrine wrong at 30,000 feet, something was happening on the ground that would prove equally consequential. January 1942. A black man from Wichita, Kansas named James G. Thompson wrote a letter to the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most widely read African-American newspapers in the country. His letter asked questions that he knew millions of black Americans were asking privately, but that no one in the mainstream press was willing to print. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? Will things be better for the next generation in the peace to follow? Would it be demanding too much to demand full citizenship rights in exchange for the sacrificing of my life? Is the kind of America I know worth defending? These were not the questions of a coward or a disloyal citizen. They were the questions of a man being asked to die for a country that treated him as something less than fully human, and who wanted someone to acknowledge the reality of what that ask actually meant. The Pittsburgh Courier published the letter and responded with something that would become one of the most powerful symbols of the war years: the Double V campaign. 2 V's. One for victory over the Axis powers abroad, one for victory over racial discrimination at home. The campaign spread through black communities with a speed that reflected how completely it captured what millions of people were feeling but had not yet seen expressed publicly. Churches adopted it. Schools used it as a rallying point. Organizations built volunteer drives around it. The Double V campaign said something that the mainstream American war narrative was unwilling to say: that black Americans were fighting 2 wars simultaneously, and that the one being fought at home, against a system of racial oppression built into the very country they were defending, was at least as important as the one being fought in Europe and the Pacific. The military's ideology about black soldiers, that they couldn't fight, that they couldn't lead, that they were suited only to service roles, collided with reality in the winter of 1944 in a way that no amount of ideology could survive. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front, a massive assault through the Ardennes forest that inflicted more than 80,000 American casualties in weeks and created a desperate, critical shortage of infantry replacements. Suddenly, the color line didn't seem as important as it had in peacetime. Commanders received orders to integrate black volunteers into any unit that needed them. General Dwight Eisenhower, who had initially resisted the order, was required to form black volunteer platoons for combat units that would have previously excluded them entirely. The results of these integrated units were unambiguous. They fought, effectively, alongside white soldiers, in the same units, under the same conditions, with no difference in performance that the Army's own evaluators could document. Black soldiers had known this all along. The Army needed a world war and a crisis to discover it. Perhaps no story better illustrates the combination of institutional determination to exclude black soldiers and their ultimate, undeniable presence than the history of the Montford Point Marines. The Marine Corps had not accepted black recruits since 1798, 144 years. In June 1942, under pressure from civil rights organizations and the reality of wartime manpower needs, the Corps began recruiting its first black Marines in the modern era. The resistance was institutional and personal. Major General Thomas Holcomb, the Marine Corps commandant, resented being forced to accept African Americans into his branch. Unlike the Army, the Marine Corps refused to commission any black officers until November 1945. The discrimination was so deep, so reflexively assumed, that in May 1943, a private named R.J. Wood was arrested for impersonating a Marine while traveling home on leave, because the police officer who stopped him simply could not process the existence of a black Marine. In North Carolina, a policeman slapped official Marine Corps orders out of Edgar Cole's hand, refusing to believe they were real. Black Marines did not exist in the understanding of the world these men operated in. Except they did. And on the battlefields of Peleliu, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the Montford Point Marines proved it in the most definitive way available to them. By 1944, over 18,000 men had trained at Montford Point, 12,000 served overseas. In 2012, the United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor, to the Montford Point Marines as a group. The recognition came 70 years after they had earned it, 1946. President Harry Truman was receiving reports from across the American South of black veterans, men who had recently returned from fighting Nazi Germany in Europe and Imperial Japan in the Pacific, being beaten, terrorized, and in some cases lynched in the communities they had come home to. One case in particular reached Truman in a way that, by his own account, physically affected him. Staff Sergeant Isaac Woodard. Woodard was traveling home by bus on February 12, 1946, the day of his military discharge, still in uniform, when a confrontation with a bus driver led to his removal from the bus and an encounter with the local police chief in Batesburg, South Carolina. The police chief beat Woodard with a blackjack, specifically and deliberately targeting his eyes. Isaac Woodard, who had spent the past year serving his country in the Pacific, was permanently blinded on the day of his discharge. When Truman heard the full account, his response was immediate. "My stomach turned." He appointed an interracial civil rights committee to investigate. Their report was one of the most damning official government documents in American history, condemning Jim Crow laws explicitly and calling for immediate desegregation. In 1948, Truman signed Executive Order 9981, mandating the full integration of the United States Armed Forces. The order was controversial. It was fought by military leadership who had spent careers maintaining the segregated system. Its implementation was uneven and slow. But by the end of the Korean War, the transformation was functionally complete. The United States military, the institution that had filed a document in 1925 declaring black men inherently weak in character, was integrated. Not because America had become morally enlightened, but because 1.2 million black soldiers had made the lie of that 1925 document impossible to maintain. Here is the question we want you to carry with you after this video ends, and we want your answer in the comments. Over 1.2 million black Americans served in World War II. They fought in segregated units, under segregated conditions, for a country with segregated blood banks. They came home to Isaac Woodard's fate, beaten and blinded in uniform on the day of his discharge. And they kept fighting, not just abroad, but at home, until Truman signed Executive Order 9981. What do you think would have happened if black veterans had not continued that fight after the war ended? And what does it mean that this history is not at the center of how we teach World War II? Drop your answer below. We genuinely want to know what you think. Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first black justice of the United States Supreme Court, said something about the experience of black soldiers in World War II that captures the full weight of their service. In recognizing the humanity of our fellow beings, we pay ourselves the highest tribute. What black soldiers did in World War II was not simply serve their country. They forced their country to recognize their humanity. They did it at 30,000 feet over Berlin, shooting down German jet fighters and aircraft the military had expected them to crash. They did it on Italian hillsides, destroying fortified German positions that the army had decided black soldiers weren't suited to assault. They did it at Pearl Harbor, behind a gun they'd never been trained on, because the enemy was coming and the training policy had become irrelevant. They did it in the letters they wrote home, in the newspapers they read, in the WWII campaign they built and maintained throughout the war, insisting, publicly and persistently, that their service came with a legitimate claim to the citizenship and dignity that had been withheld from them. They did it by coming home in 1945 and refusing, unlike the generation before them, who had come home from World War I to the Red Summer of 1919, to quietly reabsorb the indignity. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s did not emerge from nowhere. It was built, in significant part, by men and women who had spent World War II fighting two wars and had returned home with an absolute, irrevocable refusal to keep accepting the terms of only one victory. This is why Hidden Black Files exists. Because the story of Black Americans in World War II, complete, unedited, with all of its injustice and all of its extraordinary achievement held together, is one of the most important stories in the history of this country, not as a feel-good addendum to the Greatest Generation narrative, as the story that most directly challenges that narrative and demands it be told differently. 1.2 million people. Segregated blood banks. A 1925 Army document declaring them inherently inferior. German POWs treated better than black soldiers on American soil, and 15,000 combat sorties, and the Medal of Honor earned and withheld for 50 years, and the blind veteran who turned a president's stomach and ended the segregated military. Both things, all of it, together. That is the history, and you deserve to know it. Subscribe to Hidden Black Files. Share this video with someone who was taught the paragraph version of this story and deserves the full one. Leave a comment with your answer to the questions we've asked, or with whatever this history has left you thinking about. Because if we don't tell these stories, if we allow the paragraph to stand in for the truth, then the men and women who fought two wars simultaneously are being asked to disappear a second time. Hidden Black Files exists so that never happens.